A judge known for her strictness faces an accusation that seems trivial, but touches on her deeply personal memories. An unacknowledged criminal reveals secrets from her past, forcing her to question her own decisions. An internal conflict between duty and humanity leads to unexpected consequences for both. Sometimes, to restore justice, you need to go against all the rules. Don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss new stories. The early morning light was quietly filtering into the Gravesville courtroom before the full daylight had begun to dawn outside. The courtroom was traditionally decorated. Dark wood, massive chairs, formal but comfortable for the occupants, and a hushed expectation that hung in the air like the smell of old books in a library. The courtroom was cozy, as if every case, no matter how important, was your friend's personal case. With each passing year, with each case, there was no room for empty words or noise. It was as quiet as some ancient temple. In the chair of the chairman, as usual, sat Marianne Stewart, a middle-aged woman whose stern features did not allow themselves to be overly emotional and whose eyes were always full of interest in the cases, but restrainedly professional. Marianne was considered one of the most experienced judges in the district. She had seen the most terrible and the strangest cases, but none of them could surprise her. She was proud of this. She was sure that nothing would shake her inner world. The room was quiet today, almost cozy, despite the slight tension emanating from the people waiting their turn. Marianne glanced at the list of cases in front of her. Thomas Warner, accused of stealing a loaf of bread and a tin of tea. In her head, it didn't even sound like an actual crime. It was almost a joke. In the dock sat an elderly man with faded eyes, a frail body, and clothes that had clearly seen better years. An old coat, slightly large trousers, and shoes that had nothing to do with fashion. He did not look around, did not pay attention to those present in the courtroom. His face was calm, almost impassive, as if he was sitting in a chair not under accusation, but in his chair in an old house reading a book. Mariana froze for a second, looking at him with slight bewilderment. He was different. There was something strange in his behavior. Strange, but at the same time ordinary. There was no fear, no guilt, no worries, only a silent acceptance of what was happening. "Thomas Warner," Marianne said, barely raising her eyes from the paper. "Do you admit your guilt?" Thomas looked up, met her gaze, and simply nodded. "Yes, I admit it," he said, his voice deep, quiet, but with clear confidence. There were quiet whispers in the hall. Several people sitting on the benches exchanged glances, and someone even couldn't help but chuckle. What could be simpler than clearing a man of the charge of stealing a loaf of bread? It was almost funny, but Marianne felt that there was something more to this case, something elusive. She threw the papers aside, trying to focus on the defendant. There was no fear in his eyes, but there was a light of some kind of weariness, exhaustion, like a man who had been through a lot. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft, almost invisible gesture, when Thomas took an old notebook out of his worn jacket. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said calmly, ignoring the looks from the others. "But I need to show you something." Marianne blinked, slightly confused. She wasn't used to defendants taking personal items out of their pockets in the middle of a trial, but she nodded, allowing him to continue. Thomas opened the notebook, looked down at the pages, and, as if oblivious to everything around him, began to read aloud. "Marianne Stewart, 1987. I brought you food in the hospital when you were in a car accident. 1992. You had a sore throat, and I brought you broth every night, leaving it at your door." The words seemed to freeze in the air. Marianne forced herself to breathe and look away. Her heart sank, and a memory suddenly enveloped her like an old fog that had long since passed. Those memories, blocked somewhere deep, surfaced like a fleeting dream. In that moment, she actually remembered how her life had changed dramatically in those years. She remembered how young she had been, how she had suffered from pain after her life had turned upside down on that fateful night, and how someone, a stranger, had helped her without asking for anything in return. Her eyes met Thomas's. He didn't ask. He didn't beg. He simply reminded her that there are moments of kindness in life that are forgotten or ignored. Marianne felt her own memory come crashing down on her with renewed force. "It was you," she said, her voice barely containing her emotions. "It was you who helped me then?" Thomas nodded silently, his expression unchanging. He was a simple man who never sought gratitude, never sought recognition. He was simply a man who did what he thought was right, not something out of the ordinary. The words were empty in his mouth when he spoke of good deeds. "I didn't expect gratitude," he said quietly, "but I remembered that you weren't alone then." Marianne clenched her fists, barely holding back tears. Everything that had happened in this room, everything she had thought, simply disappeared. All the years of judging, all her strict decisions, it didn't matter. In that moment, she realized that she couldn't act differently. This man she barely remembered, who had been the hidden hero of her life, was now sitting in front of her, accused of a simple crime. And it wasn't fair. "This is incredible," she whispered. Her eyes met the eyes of the others present in the room, but their gazes were already empty and distant. The trial seemed to have frozen. The people in the room felt this moment, the moment of truth, when humanity triumphs over formalities. Marianne clutched the paper in her hands, but her hands did not tremble, and her heart beat in unison with those minutes that flew by like an instant. "I'm dropping the charges," she said with confidence. "This man doesn't deserve to be punished. The charges are dropped." Thomas didn't say a word. He stood up, gathered his things, and walked towards the exit. But as he passed by, he stopped for a second and looked back. Marianne saw his eyes meet hers, and she knew that everything would change in their lives now. It's unknown what happened next, but that moment remained in her memory forever. The hall fell silent again. Marianne sat in her office, staring out the window, through which the rays of the setting sun were barely penetrating. Everything in the courtroom was familiar and calm, but inside her soul, a storm was raging. She could not get rid of the memories of today's case, of Thomas Warner's look, his calm words, the notebook he had taken out, the pages with her name, events from her life that she barely remembered. This was not a simple case. This was something much more. Her office was as quiet as a chapel. Only the clock on the wall measured the time, as if counting every moment, leaving a trace in her head. Marianne rested her head on her palm and closed her eyes. Her consciousness returned again and again to those years, to those events when she was just starting her career and was full of ambition, but still so inexperienced in life. Her hand instinctively reached for the phone. The number was familiar. She dialed it without thinking. A clear signal, and a few seconds later a voice rang out. "Yes, Mariana?" The interlocutor's voice sounded tired, but there was also confidence, like that of a person who was used to being there at moments of difficult decisions. "I can't stop thinking about this case," she said, making no attempt to hide her emotions. "I can't shake the feeling that it was something more than a simple crime." "You always say that when you feel something important has been hidden." The answer was calm, but with a noticeable amount of understanding. "What is it this time?" "Thomas Warner, accused of stealing bread and tea, remembered everything I tried to forget." Her voice wavered. He was the man who helped me when I was young and helpless. The one who brought me food and medicine when I couldn't get out of bed." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "Are you sure? It's not just a coincidence?" The interlocutor did not try to argue, but there was anxiety in his voice. Marianne took a deep breath, feeling the chill of Thomas's words still seeping into her heart. He hadn't asked for forgiveness, hadn't begged her for forgiveness for what he had done, but she felt something was wrong. This had become personal. She couldn't just let him go. "I wasn't ready. I don't remember this man, but he didn't forget me, and he reminded me of how important it is not to forget." She looked out the window, seeing the sky darken. He was just there then, and now I have to make the right choice. Don't rush into decisions, Marianne. You've always been too emotional when it came to your own experiences. Remember, you're a judge, not a savior. The other man's voice softened, but it remained serious. "But I can't just forget what he did for me. It's not just someone else's act. It's part of my life." Marianne felt a pain tighten in her chest. "How can I be as cold as he taught me to be?" "You answered yourself," the interlocutor said with a hint of warmth in his voice. "You can't be cold because you're human. You have to find a balance." She put the phone down, feeling her breathing become calmer. But her soul remained heavy. Everything that was happening seemed to turn her inside out, forcing her to rethink not only her own actions, but herself as well. Soon she got up from the table and headed for the door. Everything was quiet in the courtroom, but the air there was cold as iron. Marianne stepped out into the hall, her footsteps echoing through the empty hallways of the building. Outside, the city was bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, illuminating her path. She felt the tension building inside her, as if the world was once again at a crossroads. As she entered the courtroom, she saw the empty spot in the dock where Thomas had been sitting. He had already left, but her gaze was caught by his old jacket, still on the chair. Marianne walked over to it, her fingers instinctively running over the material. It was an ordinary, worn garment, but now it symbolized something more. She looked at the jacket, then at the window, where the setting sun was illuminating the far corner of the courtroom, creating a golden streak on the floor. His words, his voice, came back to her mind. He hadn't asked for forgiveness. He had simply reminded her. And now she had a choice. Maybe this wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe this was all part of something much more important. Marianne sighed, and her gaze fell once more on the empty dock. Deep down, she already knew what she had to do. She couldn't be blind to what had happened. And even though this choice was difficult, she had already made it. This time, the decision had to come from the heart. No matter how hard she tried to remain objective, this matter was personal. She couldn't turn away from her past life, from those who had once helped her, even if they were accused of theft. Then she went to her desk, pulled out the file, and slowly began to read the papers. The lines on the sheet seemed so mundane, but in their context she now sensed something more. This was not just a formality. This was her test. She looked up, thinking again about what she had to do, and this time she was ready to make a decision. Marianne woke up that day with the feeling that the sky outside was not as usual. She looked at the clock. It was almost 7 in the morning. The day had not started like all the others. The sun was shining brightly, filling the room with golden rays. But her soul was heavy and restless. Yesterday had left a mark on her, and she could not get rid of the thought that everything that had happened was part of some much deeper process than she had assumed. She got out of bed and went to the window, feeling how every step echoed in her body. She could still smell the old courtroom, all those moments with Thomas, his strange words and looks. She took a deep breath and tried to focus. Yesterday everything had been so clear, but now questions swirled in her head, giving her no peace. Why was she so worried? Why had this particular incident affected her so deeply? Marianne couldn't understand what was so special about him. How many times had she sat in this place, listened to the most difficult, the most brutal cases? But this man, with his simple words and easy look, made her think. The house was quiet. Marianne approached the cup of coffee placed on the table. Hot steam rose, creating a cozy atmosphere in her kitchen. She sat down at the table, leaning her elbows, and looking out the window, began to remember the moments when she was younger, when life seemed easier and elections were not so important. She remembered her first job as a judge's assistant, how she experienced every mistake, how she tried to be perfect, ideal in the eyes of others. She smiled, remembering how she learned to find a balance between strict laws and the human face of justice. But today she couldn't find that balance. Today she was tormented by the memory of that man who had once been there for her when she was having a hard time. And now he sat in front of her, accused of stealing. But she saw it as more than just an accident. She remembered how hard it was for her when she started working, how much fear and uncertainty she felt in her youth. And this man, who was her invisible angel, helped her without asking for anything in return. How could she forget that? The day passed, and Marianne came to work late. She couldn't escape the thoughts that filled her head. Everything in the courthouse was familiar. It was the same room, the same walls, the same people waiting for their turn, but the atmosphere was different. The moment she entered the room, she felt everything around her freeze. The energy in the room was different. She stood in front of the huge door, and inside she felt as if she had entered something bigger than just a court hearing. When Marianne entered, all eyes turned to her. She couldn't help but notice how coldly and distantly her colleagues' glances slid over her. The judge she was supposed to work with today sat at his desk, looking at her with curiosity. He was one of those people who were used to strict laws and did not notice human details. "Marianne, you better get some rest," he said with a hint of surprise in his voice as she sat down at her desk. "No, I'm ready," she answered without looking in his direction. Her eyes were tired, but there was a fire in them. She knew she couldn't walk away from this case. She had to decide what to do with Thomas. Not only his future depended on this decision, but also her own perception of justice. After all, sometimes even those who don't ask for help need it, and she couldn't close her eyes to what was happening in her soul any longer. She knew she had made a choice, but was she ready to face the consequences? Marianne glanced around the room, feeling the tension in the air. There were different people in the room today, completely different from the usual. This wasn't just a case of theft. This was a case about a man who had suddenly given her back her own memories, reminding her of who she was. She looked at the case list. Her entire routine fell apart when she thought about Thomas. She knew that not only was his life at stake, but her perception of justice. This was more important than any other case, more important than she had ever imagined. She felt her hand shake as she picked up the file. In that moment, it all became clear to her. She couldn't leave this case unchanged. "Marianne, what are you going to do with him?" asked her colleague, standing at her desk. She looked at him, but did not answer right away. The answer was in her soul. She knew that this case had touched her more deeply than anything she had ever seen before, and she felt that she could no longer be the same. With this case, she was no longer just a judge. She became a person who had to make a choice, not only according to the law, but also according to her conscience. And this choice was difficult for her. "I can't leave it like this. He deserves more than just punishment," she said, her voice filled with surprising determination. Her colleagues looked at her carefully, but no one objected. Everything was decided. She knew that this decision would change her life and the lives of others. But perhaps she would change too. And that was important. That evening, sitting in her office, Marianne turned to the documents again. She couldn't continue until she made the right choice. Everything she saw in this case made her look at the world in a new way. And at that moment, she realized that the only thing she could do was give him a chance. Not for his past good deeds, but because he reminded her that people should not forget their true values. And she signed the decision. Marianne stood by the window, lost in her thoughts. That evening, the setting sun filled her office with a soft, warm light. But her heart remained heavy. Her mind was spinning with thoughts of what she had done. Her hand instinctively reached for the phones and emails. But all she wanted was to be alone, to think about the decision she had made. She felt the tension that had been holding her down gradually fading. But the space for that tension was being filled with something new, something unknown. She couldn't sleep all night. With each passing minute, it became clearer to her that her decision was not just a coincidence. It was a moment when she had to make the right choice, not follow a clear but cold law. That incident with Thomas Warner, his words and look, like a bolt from the blue, made her reconsider what she considered right. And she realized that the decision should not be like all the others. It was personal. She sat at the table, trying to collect her thoughts. The file lay in front of her, but she could no longer look at it the same way. Every line, every number, every point now seemed to her part of a story that touched not only her work, but also her heart. Several days passed, but the mental heaviness did not leave her. She reread everything that had happened in this trial over and over again, and one thing did not leave her mind. What if she was wrong? Marianne felt the weight of this choice pressing on her chest, and each step led her further into a feeling of uncertainty. Maybe she had made a mistake by not considering all sides of the case. She came to work that day feeling like everything she had ever considered important had lost its meaning. This court, this room, this building, it all seemed so foreign. But one thought wouldn't leave her. She had already made a decision, and this wasn't just another case. It was something bigger. When she entered the boardroom, everything around her seemed to freeze. Light, as always, came through the high windows, creating soft shadows on the floor. This place had always been her refuge, where she felt control, power, but today her soul was broken, and no walls could hide it. Her gaze met the eyes of her colleagues, but they did not read in her face what was going on inside. She had always been strict and decisive for them, and now her indecisiveness seemed almost ridiculous. Marianne felt as if each glance imposed new obligations on her, as if all her colleagues in this room were expecting confidence from her, something she so lacked. But her gaze fell elsewhere. On the empty dock, where he had sat a few days ago, where the man who had made her rethink everything she knew had sat, where Thomas Warner had sat. She didn't know what to do now. All the feelings she had felt seemed alien to her in this place. She walked up to the table and carefully placed her hands on the documents, not knowing what to do next. The room was full. People were waiting for her decision, but she couldn't choose the right path. "Marianne, are you okay?" asked her colleague, a judge named Richard Page. His voice was as serious as ever, but there was something about it that made her look up. "Yeah, I'm fine. I just have a lot going on in my head," she said, not looking at him. She couldn't tell him the whole truth. It would be too hard. Instead, she picked up a few documents and began to look at them, but she didn't notice what was in them. Her thoughts were far away. Richard was silent for a moment, and then said with a smile, "You're always so confident, but it seems this incident has affected you more than you'd like to admit." She turned and looked at him, her eyes full of pain. She didn't want to say what was going on inside her. She couldn't explain why Thomas had affected her like that. This man, Marianne sighed, trying to collect her thoughts. He reminded me of what I was trying to forget, about how important it is to be human in a world full of cruelty. Richard was silent, watching her. There was understanding in his eyes, but also some concern. He knew her. He knew that she never left room for doubt, but now the doubt was in her eyes. The meeting began. The room grew quieter as Marianne announced the start. All eyes were on her. She felt her heart pounding as she opened the documents related to Thomas's case. It was difficult, but she had to follow her principles. But what if those principles weren't so perfect after all? Marianne felt like every glance at the documents gave her a new sense of what she had to do. She looked up at the people in the room and realized that each of them was part of this story, part of her life. And now that her own principles were being questioned, she couldn't be sure what she would do next. The trial went on, and every moment seemed endless. She felt her indecision casting a shadow over her decision. But then came the moment when she had to look into the defendant's eyes again. Those eyes that reminded her of her past, of her mistakes, of what she had hidden for so long. Marianne looked at the empty dock and realized that it was Thomas who had given her the chance to see this in herself. "Let's continue the meeting," she said quietly but firmly. "We must make decisions that reflect our values." Her voice was firm, but inside she felt that only now, only through this incident, could she begin to act for real, starting with forgiveness, not only for others, but for herself. Marianne sat in her office, her eyes fixed on the windows through which the cold winter wind had not yet managed to penetrate. She felt as if there was still a sense of ambiguity in her soul, as if her inner world was at odds with what was happening around her. Everything that had happened seemed at once part of her work and part of her life. She knew that she could no longer be the same as before. This incident with Thomas Warner had made her think about many things, and perhaps not about what she considered necessary for her profession. Her thoughts returned again and again to the moment she had made her decision. Dropping the charges against Thomas had not been a simple act of mercy. It had been an acknowledgement that sometimes the law could not account for every aspect of human life, that there were things in the world that could not be measured by precise rules and criteria. The case had changed the way she thought about her job. It had revealed a new truth, one that had been hidden beyond the cold, hard norms. She stood up and walked over to the bookshelf that, as always, calmed her down in difficult moments. Taking one of them, she sat down at the table and began to leaf through the pages. It was a collection of old court cases that once touched on the most diverse aspects of human life. In every line, in every decision, she found something that left a mark on her soul. But at that very moment, in this room, in this office, she felt that no books could replace the understanding she had received thanks to Thomas. Marianne took a deep breath, setting the book down on the table. His words, his quiet, calm confession, were still ringing in her head. He hadn't even asked for forgiveness. He had simply told his story, his truth, and it was in that confession that she felt not only his pain, but her own. It wasn't just about him. It was about what she had hidden and suppressed, consumed by the demands of her job and her social role. Marianne stood up and walked to the mirror. She looked at her reflection, trying to find the confidence that had always been her defining characteristic. But today, looking into the eyes of her own shadow, she realized that she could no longer be who she had been before. She had changed, and perhaps it was for the better. She returned to the table, and as if something had nudged her, she picked up a pen and wrote a new ruling. It was simple and succinct, But for her, it was an important step forward. She knew that this moment, this decision, was not retroactive. She could not go back to who she had been before. And perhaps that was for the best. She had cleared Thomas of all charges, but more importantly, she had shed the burden of cold objectivity and allowed herself to be a person, not just a judge. With this decision, she could no longer be the Mary Ann who sat in the courtroom, harshly judging people, never noticing their pain. Now her decision was not just an act of justice, but also an act of humanity. She felt how this moment filled her life with new meaning. And this meaning was not in the strict letters of the law, but in the fact that she had learned to hear people. She learned to see them not as defendants or plaintiffs, but as those who, like her, were experiencing their own internal tragedies. That day, Mary Ann left the office late. She did not feel tired, but on the contrary, she felt a lightness that had not been in her soul for a long time. Her steps sounded confident, but at the same time with a hint of thoughtfulness. In this city, in this courthouse, she was no longer the same. In her eyes burned that very fire that she had once tried to hide behind the wall of her professional rules and regulations. Mary Ann walked the streets of Gravesville, and every step she took seemed significant. That evening, her city had become something new to her, something she had never noticed before. Everything around her seemed so alive, so real. The people on the streets, the passers-by, the workers in the shops and cafes, all of it filled her with new meaning. There was no longer a cold alienation in her soul. There was something much more important, the understanding that she was not just doing her job. She was now truly living. When Mary Ann returned home, she sat in her chair for a long time, just listening to the silence that filled her apartment. At that moment, she felt that she was no longer afraid of change. She realized that she herself had changed, and it was her own decision. Mary Ann no longer felt the weight of the mask she had worn before. She had become herself, and this thought filled her with peace. The following month, when Thomas Warner appeared in court again, Mary Ann looked at him not as a defendant, but as a person who had become part of her story. His face was now familiar to her, and his story was part of her life. And while she knew that for him the case was over, for her, it was just beginning. Because now she understood that it was important not only to obey the law, but also to be a person who could forgive, listen, and help. Her decision was not just an act of justice, it was forgiveness. Forgiveness for herself, and for all those who, like Thomas, once needed support. And it may be the most important lesson she learned in her long career.